The marble walls of the disciplinary hearing room echo with gasps as the surveillance footage begins to play on the massive screen mounted behind the tribunal panel. The faces of the three senior officers serving as judges remain impassive, yet their rigid postures betray their growing discomfort while watching their colleague, Officer James Barrett, patrol that fateful night. The footage shows him, a towering figure in his meticulously pressed blue uniform, approaching an unmarked black sedan through sheets of rain, his tactical flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like a sword seeking its target. The gallery, packed with fellow officers, reporters, and civil rights activists, leans forward collectively as the timestamp on the video shows 11:47 p.m. Barrett can be seen staggering toward the vehicle, his free hand already resting on his holster despite no visible threat, his boots splashing through puddles that reflect the red and blue lights spinning atop his patrol car. The woman inside the sedan, Director Sarah Washington of Internal Affairs, sits perfectly still, her hands visible on the steering wheel, following every protocol that she herself had helped write. The ambient sounds from that night fill the courtroom, the steady drumming of rain against metal and glass, the squeak of Barrett's leather gear as he approaches, the subtle whir of the sedan's engine idling in the background, creating an ominous symphony that makes the skin crawl of everyone present, knowing what comes next. The footage continues rolling as Barrett reaches the driver window, his flashlight beam deliberately aimed to blind the occupant, an intimidation tactic explicitly forbidden in the department's revised procedures. Director Washington can be seen squinting against the harsh light, her voice calm and professional as she asks the reason for the stop. Barrett barks out a response about a broken taillight, his tone dripping with condescension and barely concealed hostility, his body language growing more aggressive with each passing second. The subsequent investigation would prove that all lights on Director Washington's vehicle had been functioning perfectly that night, the false premise of the stop hanging heavy in the courtroom air. The tension in the footage builds as Director Washington carefully announces her intention to reach for her credentials, moving with deliberate slowness toward her glove compartment. Barrett tenses visibly, his right hand flexing near his weapon as the woman he doesn't yet recognize as his superior carefully opens the compartment. The damning moment approaches frame by frame in high definition. Barrett's face contorts with sudden rage as his arm swings forward, the crack of his hand against Director Washington's face reverberating through the courtroom speakers, causing several spectators to flinch. The gathered crowd watches in horror as Director Washington's head snaps to the side, her credentials scattering across the rain-soaked pavement like fallen leaves. Several gasps and muttered curses escape from the gallery as the footage shows Barrett realizing his mistake, his face transforming from smug satisfaction to dawning horror as he finally bothers to read the identification badge lying face up in a puddle. The image of Director Washington's Internal Affairs credentials, illuminated by a flash of lightning, becomes burned into the retinas of everyone present. Officer Barrett, sitting at the defense table in the present moment, remains stoic, his face a mask of practiced indifference, yet his tells are visible to the trained eye, the subtle twitch of his jaw, the microscopic beads of sweat forming at his temples, the way his fingers drum silently against the polished wood, betraying his growing awareness that his 15-year career is about to come crashing down around him. The footage continues to play, showing the aftermath of his actions as backup units arrive, their lights painting the scene in alternating red and blue, while Director Washington maintains her composure even with a rapidly swelling cheek, refusing to give Barrett the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Director Sarah Washington rises from her seat in the witness box, her movements measured and deliberate as she adjusts her charcoal gray Armani suit, a stark contrast to the chaos captured in the previous night's footage. Her presence commands attention without demanding it as she settles into position beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the disciplinary hearing room. Not a single whisper can be heard as she begins her testimony, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the packed chamber. The gallery watches transfixed as she methodically reconstructs the events that led to her being on that rain-slicked street. She describes leaving her office after a late-night meeting, reviewing personnel files, ironically including several complaints about Officer Barrett that had mysteriously disappeared from the system over the years. She explains how she had noticed the patrol car following her for 3 blocks before the lights finally flashed. She had already suspected profiling but chose to document every detail for what would become yet another case file. Director Washington's voice remains unwavering as she recounts her exact words and actions during the Stop Her training as both an officer and internal affairs director, evident in her precise recall. She demonstrates with her hands how she had kept them visible on the steering wheel at all times, even adjusting her rearview mirror to ensure Barrett could see her movements clearly in his approach. The fluorescent lights catch the faint discoloration of makeup on her left cheek, a silent testament to the violence she endured. The prosecutor guides her through the sequence of events, her testimony painting a vivid picture that brings the video footage to life. She describes the metallic taste of blood filling her mouth after the strike, the rain mixing with it, as she forced herself to remain still, knowing that any reaction could escalate the situation. Her years of experience dealing with problem officers transforming from abstract policy into visceral reality. In that moment, she explains how she watched her credentials scatter across the wet pavement, her internal affairs badge landing face up in a puddle reflecting the strobing lights above. A ripple of murmurs passes through the assembled crowd as Director Washington details the subtle shift in Barrett's demeanor, the moment he recognized her position, his attempted backpedaling, his sudden switch to professional courtesy, his fumbling excuses about officer safety, all documented in her mental notes. Even as she maintained her composure, she describes how other officers arrived at the scene, their faces shifting from automatic support of their fellow officer to poorly concealed panic as they realized who Barrett had attacked. The courtroom falls completely silent as she produces her phone records showing 4 calls she made immediately after the incident, first to the police commissioner, then to the district attorney, followed by the heads of the Civil Rights Division and the police union. Her methodical documentation of every protocol followed, every regulation observed, standing in stark contrast to Barrett's increasingly obvious violations. She presents her medical examination results, photographs of the bruising, and technical analysis of the force used, all while maintaining eye contact with the tribunal members. Barrett squirms visibly in his chair as Director Washington describes the following morning when she walked into her office, despite the swelling and bruising, refusing to take time off, knowing that every hour of delay meant potential evidence lost or witnesses pressured into silence. She explains how she personally supervised the collection of Barrett's bodycam footage, dashcam recordings, and department records, revealing a pattern that should have been caught years ago, if not for the systemic failures she had been working to address. As her testimony draws to a close, Director Washington finally allows her professional mask to crack slightly, her voice taking on an edge of controlled anger as she connects this incident to the hundreds of civilian complaints that had crossed her desk over the years. She turns her gaze directly to Barrett, her eyes carrying the weight of every case that had been dismissed, every victim who had been ignored, every officer who had escaped accountability. Until now, the room holds its breath as she delivers her final statement, summarizing not just one night of violence, but years of institutional failure that made it possible. Defense attorney Michael Thorne rises from his seat, his $1,000 suit already showing signs of distress, dark patches of sweat visible beneath his arms as he approaches the podium, clutching a stack of papers that trembles slightly in his grasp. The experienced lawyer, known for defending officers in misconduct cases, finds himself facing an unprecedented challenge as he attempts to salvage Officer Barrett's career from the wreckage of irrefutable evidence. The leather of his expensive shoes squeaks against the polished floor as he paces before the tribunal, his opening statement about Barrett's decorated 15-year career echoing hollowly in the chamber. He presents commendations and letters of appreciation from citizens, carefully selected to paint a picture of a dedicated public servant, while carefully avoiding any mention of the numerous complaints buried in internal affairs files. Director Washington watches from her seat, her steady gaze causing him to stumble over rehearsed words that suddenly sound hollow even to his own ears. The defense strategy crumbles further as Thorne attempts to justify Barrett's actions on the night in question, arguing about poor visibility and officer safety protocols, but the high-definition footage playing behind him betrays every word, the camera's multiple angles showing crystal clear visibility. Despite the rain, the streetlights illuminating every detail of Barrett's aggressive approach and unprovoked assault. The attorney swallows hard as the tribunal members lean forward, their expressions growing increasingly stern as the disparity between his claims and the visual evidence widens. Desperation creeps into Thorne's voice as he presents a series of statistics about officer injuries during traffic stops, attempting to establish a baseline of reasonable fear. But Director Washington's legal team counters immediately with Barrett's own dashcam footage from earlier that same evening, showing 6 previous stops, all targeting minority drivers, all conducted with the same aggressive approach that led to the incident. The defense attorney loosens his tie as the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. His client's record of discrimination laid bare before the tribunal. A murmur ripples through the gallery as Thorne introduces an expert witness, a retired police trainer, who attempts to justify Barrett's use of force, but under cross-examination, the expert is forced to admit that nothing in the footage shows any action by Director Washington that would warrant physical response. The expert shifts uncomfortably in his seat as the prosecution forces him to watch the incident frame by frame, his credibility dissolving as he struggles to explain away the obvious violations of department protocol. The defense attorney's hands shake visibly as he shuffles through his papers, searching for anything to counter the mounting evidence against his client, but each argument he presents seems to dig a deeper hole. Barrett sits at the defense table, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes betray growing panic as his carefully constructed justifications fall apart one by one under the weight of his own recorded actions. The bodycam footage continues to play in an endless loop, each viewing revealing new details that further erode his defense. Thorne makes a last desperate attempt to shift blame, suggesting that Director Washington should have identified herself immediately, but the suggestion backfires spectacularly as the prosecution points out that Barrett had never given her the opportunity to reach for her credentials before resorting to violence. The defense attorney winces as his own words are used to highlight his client's failure to follow basic procedure, the very protocols Barrett had sworn to uphold. The atmosphere in the courtroom grows heavier with each passing moment as Thorne realizes he is fighting a losing battle. His usual tactics of procedural arguments and character witnesses rendered useless by the overwhelming visual evidence and Director Washington's impeccable documentation. The tribunal members exchange glances, their expressions making it clear that Barrett's decorated career is reaching its inglorious end, while the defense attorney continues his futile attempts to construct a narrative of reasonable doubt in a case where doubt has no room to exist. Officer Miguel Ramirez steps into the witness box, his rookie uniform still creased with newness. Only 6 months out of the academy, his young face carries the weight of someone about to shatter the unspoken code of silence that has protected corrupt officers for generations. His hands tremble slightly as he raises them to take the oath, but his voice rings clear and strong through the hushed courtroom as he swears to tell the truth, knowing that this testimony will forever mark him among his fellow officers. The young officer begins his account, starting with his first day at the precinct, when Barrett had taken him aside to explain how things really worked. His senior officer explaining which neighborhoods deserved extra attention, which drivers to pull over, which complaints could be ignored. Ramirez describes the subtle pressure to conform, the way senior officers would praise those who followed the unwritten rules and isolate those who questioned them, his voice growing stronger as he reveals the toxic culture that had festered beneath the surface of their prestigious department. Director Washington leans forward slightly in her chair, her eyes never leaving the young officer as he recounts specific incidents, the break room conversations where Barrett would brag about teaching certain people their place, the high fives exchanged after aggressive stops, the warnings to rookies about being too soft. His testimony painting a vivid picture of systemic racism hidden behind a thin veneer of procedure and protocol. Barrett sits rigid in his chair, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth as his former protege exposes years of carefully hidden behavior. The gallery erupts in whispers as Ramirez describes the night after Director Washington's assault, how Barrett had burst into the locker room, ranting about being set up, claiming that Internal Affairs had orchestrated the entire incident to undermine good police work. The rookie recalls how other officers had quickly closed ranks, suggesting ways to discredit Washington or pressure her to drop the complaint. The casual discussion of witness intimidation revealing how deeply rooted the problem had become. Tears begin to well in Ramirez's eyes as he describes his own struggle with coming forward. The sleepless nights, wrestling with his conscience, the memory of his grandmother telling him to be the change he wanted to see in the world. His voice catches as he reveals the threatening notes left in his locker after word got out that Internal Affairs had contacted him. The silence from fellow officers who once greeted him warmly, the sudden isolation that made every shift feel like walking through enemy territory. The prosecution guides him through specific dates and times when Barrett had dissembled his body count during traffic stops. Ramirez testifying about the coded language used to warn other officers about surveillance, the systematic way complaints from minority communities were buried or dismissed. His testimony, corroborated by a notebook he had secretly kept logging incidents that seemed wrong, but that he had been too afraid to report until now. Director Washington nods almost imperceptibly, her expression softening as she recognizes the tremendous courage it takes for a rookie to stand against the Brotherhood. Barrett stares daggers at his former trainee, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists beneath the defense table, as Ramirez details the pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years, the younger officer never backing down, never wavering in his account, even as the weight of dozens of hostile stares bears down upon him from the gallery, where other officers sit in stony silence, their expressions promising consequences for this breach of loyalty. The testimony reaches its crescendo as Ramirez describes his final conversation with Barrett just days before the hearing, how his former mentor had cornered him in the parking garage, alternating between threats and bribes trying to ensure his silence. The rookie pulls out his phone, playing a recording of the encounter that leaves no doubt about the department's culture of corruption and cover-ups, the sound of Barrett's desperate attempts at intimidation echoing through the now silent courtroom, serving as a damning exclamation point to hours of testimony about systemic abuse of power. Dad Catherine Chen steps forward, her credentials as the department's leading forensic video analyst displaying on the screen behind her 20 years of experience in law enforcement technology analysis, making her testimony unimpeachable. She adjusts her wide-rimmed glasses as the courtroom transforms into an impromptu theater of truth, multiple screens descending from the ceiling to provide every angle of the incident in crystalline high definition. The analyst begins her dissection of the footage, her laser pointer dancing across the screens with surgical precision as she breaks down the encounter millisecond by millisecond. The first violation appears before Barrett even exits his patrol car, his dashcam footage showing no probable cause for the traffic stop as Director Washington's tail lights gleam perfectly in the rain, their functionality clearly visible in the high-resolution replay. Dr. Chen marks this as violation number 1, her counter in the corner of the screen beginning its damning ascent. Frame by frame, the evidence mounts. Barrett's approach angle shows clear deviation from department protocol, his aggressive stance and hand position on his weapon, marking violations 2 and 3. Chen overlays standard procedure guidelines, highlighting how Barrett deliberately positioned his flashlight to disorient and intimidate rather than illuminate for safety. The gallery watches in stunned silence as she demonstrates how his actions aligned perfectly with textbook examples of police intimidation tactics. The technical breakdown continues relentlessly as Chen analyzes Barrett's body language using advanced behavioral analysis software, his microexpressions revealing predetermined hostility before any interaction even occurs. The program highlights subtle indicators of aggressive intent that untrained observers might miss. The defensive attorney slumps further in his chair as the analyst presents statistical analysis showing the mathematical impossibility of these patterns occurring by chance across Barrett's previous stops. Director Washington watches intently as Dai Chen compiles a split-screen comparison showing Barrett's approach patterns across 20 different traffic stops involving minority drivers, the AI-assisted analysis revealing identical intimidation techniques used repeatedly, the software tracking his movement patterns, hand positions, and verbal escalation tactics, building an irrefutable case of systematic targeting. The tribunal members lean forward, their expressions growing darker with each new revelation. The atmosphere grows heavier as Dai Chen shifts to the moment of assault, the footage now playing at 1/10 speed, every muscle movement, every micro-decision captured in excruciating detail. She demonstrates how Barrett had begun his striking motion before Director Washington had even reached for her credentials, the premeditated nature of his action clear in the frame-by-frame breakdown. The analyst overlays force vectors showing the calculated nature of a strike designed to cause maximum psychological impact while minimizing visible injury, a technique that spoke to practiced application. Barrett's previous body camera footage appears on the secondary screens, Dai Chen highlighting suspicious patterns of camera deactivation across hundreds of stops, her analysis revealing statistical anomalies that could only indicate deliberate manipulation. The timeline she presents shows cameras consistently failing during encounters with minority citizens, only to mysteriously resume function moments after critical incidents. The mathematical probability of such selective malfunctions occurring naturally calculated to be less than 1 in 10 million. The technical evidence reaches its crescendo as Dai Chen presents a comprehensive digital reconstruction of the incident, multiple camera angles merged into a three-dimensional model that allows the tribunal to view the encounter from any position. Her software strips away the rain and darkness, revealing every detail with perfect clarity. The defense team's attempts to claim poor visibility or confusion crumbling in the face of irrefutable digital evidence that shows Barrett had a clear, unobstructed view throughout the entire encounter. As her presentation concludes, Dai Chen delivers the final blow, a statistical analysis of Barrett's entire career compiled from traffic cam footage, dash cams, and surveillance videos revealing a career-long pattern of escalation and intimidation against minority citizens. The numbers floating on screen tell their own story of systematic abuse. Counterpoint of data, another nail in the coffin of Barrett's law enforcement career, while he sits motionless at the defense table, watching 15 years of carefully hidden behavior exposed through the unblinking eye of technology. Lightning seems to crack outside the courthouse windows as Marcus Jefferson, Director Washington's lead attorney, approaches the podium, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the courtroom floor. Barrett shifts uncomfortably in the witness chair as Jefferson adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses with deliberate slowness. The seasoned civil rights attorney, known for dismantling corrupt officers on the stand, lets the silence stretch until the tension becomes almost unbearable. The cross-examination begins with deceptive gentleness, Jefferson leading Barrett through his account of that rainy night, but with each question the attorney's tone grows sharper, more precise. Like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, Barrett stumbles over simple details, his previous confidence crumbling as Jefferson highlights contradictions between his testimony and the video evidence, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead as his carefully constructed narrative starts to unravel beneath the relentless questioning. The gallery leans forward as Jefferson produces a stack of civilian complaints filed against Barrett over the years, complaints that had mysteriously vanished from official records until Director Washington's team had excavated them from deleted server backups. The attorney reads each one aloud, his voice growing stronger with each account of harassment, intimidation, and excessive force. Barrett's face grows increasingly pale as his past rises up to haunt him in the present moment, his attempts at explanation sounding hollow even to his own ears. Director Washington maintains her composed observation as Jefferson presents evidence of Barrett's bodycam irregularities, 173 incidents of camera failure, all coincidentally occurring during encounters with minority citizens. The attorney forces Barrett to explain each malfunction, his excuses becoming more desperate and contradictory with each example. The tribunal members exchange knowing glances as the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, while Barrett clutches the arms of the witness chair, his knuckles white with tension. The cross-examination takes a dramatic turn as Jefferson plays audio recordings from Barrett's patrol car, revealing conversations with other officers about targeting specific neighborhoods and drivers. Barrett attempts to claim the recordings are taken out of context, but Jefferson masterfully weaves them into a tapestry of prejudice and abuse, connecting seemingly isolated incidents into a clear pattern of systematic discrimination. The officer's earlier swagger now completely evaporated as he faces the weight of his own documented words. Jefferson circles Barrett like a predator sensing weakness, his questions becoming surgical strikes, targeting the officer's credibility with previous court testimony where he had sworn under oath that his camera malfunctions were random and unpredictable. The attorney forces Barrett to admit that he had lied in those cases, his reputation for truthfulness crumbling as Jefferson presents evidence of deliberate camera tampering discovered during the internal affairs investigation. The atmosphere in the courtroom grows electric as Jefferson presents his final piece of evidence, an email chain showing Barrett had attempted to organize a campaign of intimidation against previous complainants. The attorney's voice carries traces of controlled fury as he forces Barrett to read the messages aloud, each word damning him further. The officer's voice growing weaker as he realizes the full extent of evidence assembled against him, his career dissolving before his eyes. While Director Washington writes careful notes, her pen scratching against paper, providing counterpoint to his faltering testimony, Barrett's composure finally shatters as Jefferson connects the final dots, revealing how the officer had used department resources to track and harass citizens who had filed complaints. His voice cracks as he attempts to defend actions that had seemed justified through the lens of power, but now stand revealed as naked abuse. The gallery watches in stunned silence as 15 years of carefully hidden misconduct unravels in a matter of hours, the officer's attempts at explanation dying in his throat as Jefferson methodically strips away every defense, every excuse, every justification, leaving nothing but the ugly truth exposed under the harsh lights of justice. Special Investigator James Chen rises from the prosecution table, his tablet displaying a complex web of evidence gathered over 72 sleepless hours following Director Washington's assault. The veteran internal affairs investigator, known for his photographic memory and relentless attention to detail, approaches the presentation screen with quiet confidence as his team of analysts takes strategic positions around the courtroom, each carrying identical tablets synchronized to display their devastating findings. Their investigation timeline appears on the main screen, showing how Barrett had systematically buried complaints throughout his career. Chen demonstrates how the officer had cultivated relationships with precinct administrators who would conveniently misfile paperwork or delete digital records. The investigator pulls up recovered emails, showing a network of cooperation that spread through multiple departments. Barrett, watching helplessly as years of careful manipulation emerge into the light, his elaborate system of protection crumbling under the weight of meticulous digital forensics. Director Washington maintains her professional demeanor as Chen reveals how his team discovered Barrett's pattern of targeting specific demographics. The investigation uncovering a personal database the officer had maintained, tracking his encounters with minority citizens, addresses, phone numbers, and personal information stored illegally on his private devices. The gallery murmurs with growing disgust as Chen demonstrates how Barrett had used this information to orchestrate follow-up harassment of citizens who dared to file complaints. The presentation shifts to financial records, Chen highlighting suspicious deposits in Barrett's accounts that corresponded with disappeared complaint files, the investigator connecting dots that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Barrett slumps further in his chair as bank statements appear on screen showing patterns of deposits that could not be explained by his official salary. The defense attorney frantically scribbling notes but finding no way to justify the damning financial trail that Internal Affairs had uncovered. Chen introduces testimony from precinct administrative staff who had been pressured to alter records over the years, their sworn statements appearing on screen alongside time-stamped evidence of database modifications. The investigation had revealed how Barrett exploited his seniority to intimidate junior officers and support staff, creating a culture of fear and compliance that allowed his actions to go unchecked for over a decade. The tribunal members' faces darken as they realize the extent of corruption that had flourished under their supervision. The investigation takes an even darker turn as Chen presents evidence of retribution against officers who had attempted to report Barrett's behavior in the past. Careers, stalled transfers, denied complaints filed, all traced back to Barrett's network of influence. The investigator methodically demonstrates how the officer had constructed a web of intimidation that stretched far beyond his immediate precinct. Barrett, staring at the floor as his former colleagues in the gallery begin to whisper among themselves, their loyalty visibly wavering as the full scope of his manipulation becomes clear. Director Washington leans forward slightly as Chen reveals the critical error that finally exposed everything. Barrett's failure to recognize her had led to him following his standard procedure of disabling recording devices, but this time his actions were caught on her vehicle's automated security system. The investigation team plays synchronized footage showing Barrett tampering with his bodycam, while his own dashcam recorded the same moment from a different angle. The irrefutable evidence of deliberate misconduct drawing gasps from the gallery. The final phase of Chen's presentation focuses on the aftermath of Director Washington's assault, revealing how Barrett had immediately attempted to access and alter security footage from nearby buildings, his desperate efforts to cover his tracks, providing investigators with a treasure trove of evidence. The team demonstrates how each attempt to hide his actions only served to expose years of similar cover-ups. Barrett, watching in visible distress as his decades-long facade of professionalism dissolves, replaced by an undeniable portrait of systematic abuse of power. Director Sarah Washington rises from her seat for her closing statement, the late afternoon sun streaming through the high courthouse windows casting her shadow long across the wooden floor. The room falls into absolute silence as she approaches the podium, her heels clicking against marble, the sound echoing through the chamber like a metronome counting down the final moments of Officer Barrett's career, her presence commanding attention without demanding it as she arranges a single sheet of paper before her. She begins not with her own assault, but with the story of Maria Rodriguez, a young mother who filed a complaint against Barrett 3 years ago after a traffic stop left her terrified to drive her children to school. Director Washington recounts how the complaint vanished from system records, how Maria received mysterious parking tickets outside her workplace until she withdrew her statement. The gallery sits transfixed as Washington weaves together the stories of dozens of victims whose voices had been silenced, their experiences forming a tapestry of systemic abuse that could no longer be ignored. Her voice carries to every corner of the room as she shifts to Thomas Johnson, a retired veteran whose complaint about racial profiling resulted in repeated stops near his home. Barrett and his allies making the elderly man's life a nightmare until he too withdrew his statement. Washington methodically connects these incidents to the broader pattern, revealing how each act of intimidation, each covered-up complaint, each tampered piece of evidence represented not just individual misconduct, but a calculated assault on the very principles of justice they had sworn to uphold. The tribunal members lean forward as Director Washington presents photographs of every victim who had filed complaints against Barrett over the years, their faces appearing on the screen behind her, a silent testimony to the human cost of unchecked power. She reads their statements describing the fear, the helplessness, the erosion of trust in law enforcement that extended far beyond individual encounters to poison entire communities. Barrett stares at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of those whose lives he had impacted, while his former colleagues in the gallery shift uncomfortably in their seats. Washington turns to address the broader implications, her voice taking on an edge of controlled passion as she describes how cases like this undermine the foundation of community policing. She presents statistics showing how each covered-up complaint, each ignored report, each instance of retaliation creates ripples of distrust that last for generations, the tribunal members nodding slowly as she demonstrates how protecting officers like Barrett ultimately threatens the safety of all officers by destroying the community trust essential to effective law enforcement. The atmosphere grows heavy with significance as Director Washington finally addresses her own assault, describing it not as a personal injury, but as a moment that pulled back the curtain on years of institutional failure. She explains how her position of authority allowed her to expose what countless vulnerable citizens had faced without recourse, her voice carrying notes of both determination and regret as she acknowledges how her own department had failed those it was sworn to protect. Barrett's face growing ashen as she methodically connects his actions to the larger crisis of confidence in law enforcement. One by one, officers in the gallery begin to turn their backs on Barrett, the symbolic gesture spreading through the rows like a wave as Director Washington concludes her statement by calling for fundamental reform. She outlines specific policy changes, increased oversight mechanisms, and mandatory accountability measures, her words carrying the weight of someone who has seen the system fail from both sides, now standing at the intersection of power and responsibility with the opportunity to force real change. Her closing words resonate through the chamber as she reminds the tribunal that their decision today will send a message far beyond one officer's fate, that they have the opportunity to demonstrate that no one is above the law, that the badge represents responsibility, not immunity, that justice must be truly blind to race, rank, and position. The sun setting through the courthouse windows paints the room in shades of amber as Director Washington returns to her seat, leaving behind a silence heavy with the weight of history and the promise of change. The tribunal chairwoman, Chief Justice Sandra Martinez, rises from her seat, her black robes rustling in the charged silence of the courtroom, her face bearing the gravity of a moment that will reshape department policy for years to come. The last rays of sunset painting the chamber in deep crimson as she lifts the verdict document, her hands steady with the weight of responsibility. The room holds its collective breath as she prepares to deliver the final judgment in a case that has exposed decades of systematic abuse. Her voice rings clear and unwavering as she begins reading the findings: 19 separate violations of department policy, 8 counts of witness intimidation, 12 instances of evidence tampering, 27 confirmed cases of racial profiling, and 1 count of felony assault against a superior officer. The list continues for several minutes, each charge another nail in the coffin of Barrett's law enforcement career, his face growing paler with each conviction, while Director Washington maintains her professional composure, her eyes fixed on a future where such abuse would no longer go unchecked. The sentence comes down like a thunderbolt: immediate termination of employment, permanent revocation of law enforcement certification, surrender of pension and benefits, mandatory restitution to verified victims of abuse, criminal charges to be filed by the district attorney's office within 24 hours. Barrett slumps in his chair as the full weight of consequences crashes down around him, his carefully constructed world of power and intimidation crumbling to dust, while his former colleagues in the gallery maintained their backs turned, a visual representation of his complete isolation from the brotherhood he once manipulated. Chief Justice Martinez continues with unprecedented additional measures, announcing the formation of an independent oversight committee staffed by community members and civil rights attorneys, establishment of new protocols for handling civilian complaints, mandatory psychological evaluations for all officers, enhanced bias training requirements, and implementation of artificial intelligence monitoring systems for all police interactions. Director Washington nods slightly as each reform she had long fought for becomes official policy, her personal ordeal transforming into a catalyst for departmental transformation. The bailiffs approach Barrett, their movements precise and professional, as they prepare to take him into custody, the clink of handcuffs echoing through the chamber, providing percussion to the Chief Justice's continued reading of institutional changes. His former partner refuses to meet his eyes as he is led past the gallery, his badge and gun already surrendered, his uniform to be returned within 24 hours. The man who once swaggered through the precinct now shuffling toward a future behind bars, his authority stripped away, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of corrupted power. Director Washington stands at the courthouse window watching the rain fall, just as it had on that fateful night, the gentle patter providing counterpoint to the shuffle of departing spectators behind her. The tribunal members approach, offering quiet words of support and commitment to implementing the ordered changes. She accepts their words with graceful professionalism, her mind already turning to the work ahead, knowing that true reform requires more than a single verdict, more than one officer's downfall, more than policy changes on paper. The media gathers outside the courthouse, their cameras flashing like lightning in the growing darkness as Barrett is led to the waiting prisoner transport vehicle, his face hidden from the photographers who once captured him, receiving commendations and awards. Director Washington emerges into the rain, standing tall before the microphones as she delivers a message of hope and accountability, her words carrying to the gathered crowd of community members who have waited hours in the rain to witness this moment of justice. Inside the emptying courtroom, a young rookie officer approaches Director Washington's desk, leaving a stack of newly filed complaints that had been buried by other officers, inspired by the day's proceedings to break their own silence, the cycle of protection finally breaking as the true purpose of the badge returns to the department. One sheet of paper catches the last light of day, a single phrase visible at the top reading, "Simply the truth matters." The rain continues to fall outside, washing away years of corruption as a new era of accountability dawns within the department walls.